Thank you very much, Dave. Well, these two passages are in the lectionary this week, and there's a reason they're together. They talk about the kingdom of God. Now, kingdom isn't really a good word for us today, is it? Because, first of all, king kind of denotes male rulers. And yet, we know historically that's incorrect. Two of the greatest rulers of Great Britain were both women, Elizabeth I and Victoria. Second, kings aren't what they used to be. Used to be a king was able to do anything they darn well pleased. But now, kings have boundaries. Now, we've seen one of those boundaries just this week with the vote in Scotland. It wasn't up to the king, or in our case of today, the queen, to determine whether they could be independent, as would have been the case 2,000 years ago. The people voted on whether they wanted to be independent. So kings are different today. But third, the category of kingdom doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us. Even though Great Britain, and I've used that in all three cases, is a kingdom, we never think about it that way, do we? We think about it as a country. And it would be better, I think, if we thought, when we read the kingdom of God and the kingdom of heaven, if we thought about it as saying God's country, or the country of heaven. And that's really, I think, a much better way to understand it, because countries have citizens. And are we citizens of God's country? Now, Christians claim that we are, but are we? What does it mean to be a citizen of God's country? You know, this is the second passage in which the last shall be first and the first will be last. Actually, in the 19th chapter, the chapter just before this reading, Jesus says it. Now, of course, he says it differently. In that way, it's the first will be last and the last will be first. This way, it's the last will be first and the first will be last. He juxtaposes them. But remember, in that earlier one, he's talking about the rich person. The person who would be first is the focus. Here it's the last laborers. And both of them mean, however, the same thing. If we're to be citizens of God's country, it has to be our first priority. For in the 19th chapter, Jesus tells the crowd that unless you leave your family, your brothers, your sisters, your mother, your father, if they're more important to you than I am, you're not with me. Or you're not a citizen. Well, both of these passages are about faith and rewards. Now, the early workers wanted a greater reward. And you know, I have to feel for them. I think they deserve a greater reward. Don't you? I mean, like they said, they've worked all day in the heat of the sun. And these guys who just stood around all day until 5 got the same reward. But of course, there are other parts to that, aren't there? They were standing around all day, worried. Would they make anything for their family? Maybe the worry was worse than the work. I don't know. But of course, the point is not that. The point is, Jesus says, it's up to the vineyard owner what they get. What happens with the reward? Now, almost all commentators recognize that the vineyard owner is God. And I'm sure most of the people in Jesus' audience thought the same thing. That was a common image, the vineyard owner for God in Jewish understanding at the time. And the vineyard owner, that was his own little country. What happened in the vineyard, he got to determine. He got to determine how generous he wanted to be. Or not. You know, when we focus upon how much of a reward we're going to get, or how much recognition we're going to get, we cease to understand what it's all about. We've come here because we want to be citizens of God's country. You know, how do we do that? Well, if you're going to be a citizen of something, you need to have a relationship with that country. And in this case, a relationship with God. If you're going to be a citizen of God's country, prayer and meditation are essential. Are essential. How often do we take time to try to really figure out what it is that God would like us to do? Now, some of us have a hard time with seeing God as the big person up there who's zapping everything happening. I have a hard time with that. But I do know that when I meditate and experience God, my view of life changes. Much of what our other citizenship in this society tells me is good or important ceases to be so important. You know, understanding God's country might be more helpful if we look back at that Exodus text, not just this one, but the whole Exodus, and think about the countries they lived in. Because, you know, they lived in 3 countries. And pretty much at the same time. First of all, they lived in Egypt. And here, in this passage, you hear him say, oh, if we'd only gone back to Egypt, we'd have something to eat. You know, they make it sound so wonderful, they're forgetting they were slaves, but that's not important. Or is it? You know, in Egypt, they had their physical needs taken care of. But what about their spiritual needs? What about their emotional needs? They needed something more. They needed to be free. And so they went into a second country, the wilderness. The wilderness country. That's where they are in this passage. And they're often saying, oh, and they say this often in Exodus, if only we could go back to that better time when we were slaves and everybody could tell us exactly what to do. But the wilderness is different. The wilderness is uncertain. You don't know what's going to happen. And because you don't know what's going to happen, you have to begin to adapt. You have to change. You have to grow. Because if you don't adapt to the changes that you have in the wilderness, you will die. So, they're in the wilderness. But you know, they would have never gone into the wilderness if there wasn't a third country, the Promised Land. You know, we all want to be in the Promised Land. And in some ways, that's what Jesus is talking about as the country of heaven. God's country. It's the Promised Land. And in the Promised Land, they see something different. They see God's country. Now, I've heard God's country used more often to mean a beautiful place. Okay? As a beautiful place, it's not a problem. As long as Chet doesn't mind, I don't mind. Stay. As a beautiful country, I always remember when I was ordained in West Michigan annual conference. And anytime somebody from the Grand Traverse District spoke, they'd always say, we're from the Grand Traverse District, God's country. Meaning beautiful, nice. And I can imagine more than a few times you've heard that Aspen's God's country. Man, it's beautiful. I've said to you so many times that anywhere I look, it seems to be beautiful. I don't have to look in a certain direction. Anywhere. Well, that's one way of thinking about God's country. When Jesus talked about God's country, he was talking about the present and the future. The promised land. The reason we go through the wilderness, because being at one with God is worth the trip. As individuals, which land are you in? What country receives your allegiance? God's country? The country that we're in as a society? Make no mistakes, we are citizens of two countries. But often we are asked, which one is our first allegiance? And none of us can answer purely this or that, because sometimes the allegiances are together. But sometimes they're very different. Not only individuals, but communities also live in different lands. Aspen Community Church, as a community, lives in lands, and I would suggest that we don't live in Egypt. That while that may be comfortable, you're unhappy and complacent when you live in Egypt. I would suggest most of the time you spend in the wilderness, knowing that there is a promised land, knowing there's somewhere we're trying to get to, but we know we're not there yet. So there's more to do, more to learn. For the Israelites, they needed two things to make it through the wilderness. They needed faith, and they needed direction. Now, probably nobody knows this here because it's been a long time, but I like to sail boats. I haven't done it since I've done it once or twice, but I haven't done it since I came to Colorado long ago. But one thing that non-sailors do not understand, they think it's the wind and the sail that does the work. What they don't understand is without a keel and a rudder, sailboats make no sense. Because, you see, the wind provides the energy into the sail, which collects the energy. But without a keel, there's only one way the boat can go. It just goes with the wind. Now, for many of us, we kind of go with the flow too, don't we? It's easier that way. And from an onlooker's perspective, if there isn't any keel or if the centerboard's up and the sailboat's going the way that it wants to go, it looks like everything's fine. When we really don't have any faith, we can float a long time and it looks outside like everything's fine. But at the first big wind, at the first big crisis, we capsize. The key for our lives is faith. But that's not enough. That's part of it. But what direction are you going? Well, that requires a rudder to help move the power that you've gotten from the keel resisting the sail to put it in a certain direction. Now, often, when the Israelites were in the wilderness, they'd get upset, and Moses would go and pray to God and get some new image, come back down like today, like today's verse, and say, I know you're hungry. I know you're thirsty. This is the wilderness. We don't know what to do, but God's going to take care of you. Have faith. And they did. After the miracles, they had lots of faith for a while. Then they'd need another one, or their faith would die. Direction was also provided by Moses through his talk with God. What's our direction? Who are we as a people in this wilderness country? Direction is not easy today. More than any other generation of any other place or time, we have choices. We have lots of choices. We have what movie we're going to go to, what kind of food we're going to eat. It doesn't matter whether it's in season or not. The supermarket has it all. Thousands and thousands of different kinds of food. What events are we going to go to? What stores are we going to buy stuff? What courses are we going to take that will increase our knowledge? What sports? Let's see. Is somebody playing today? Against a team that they didn't do so well last time? Gee, I think I know about that. I'll probably even watch the game. We got lots of choices. How do we make those choices? Well, if we make them as citizens of the society we live in, the choices will be different than if we make them as citizens of God's country. Our rudder and our keel are provided by our relationship with God, just as they were provided to Moses from God. Now, some people, and I've already said that about, I did that earlier and it was not it was here in the script. I'm sorry. But Richard Rohr talks about meditation not as getting God on your side, but understanding how much we are a part of the whole. And in our prayer, we connect with the way God is. And in that connection, our lives are changed. Not because somebody's going to zap you, but rather because we now see things differently. Those who have made great changes toward the promised land, as we've gone through the wilderness, have known this fact. Martin Luther King Jr., after he graduated with a PhD from Boston University, he was Baptist, so he had calls. And he had a call from Detroit and from Birmingham. The Detroit church was much more prestigious. It was much larger. He'd have a much bigger staff. It'd be easier. The Birmingham church, on the other hand, didn't have those things. But he says, after a night of prayer, I knew my call was to go to Birmingham. Well, we know the rest of the story, don't we? The Detroit boycott, that wouldn't have made any sense. But just because he knew, not from society's perspective, from society's perspective, he should have gone to Detroit. but from seeking the promised land, he went to Birmingham. Well, I'm starting a new experience here as your pastor. And one of the things that I'm reminded of is that Max Dupree, who writes on leadership and said a lot, says this about leaders. The first duty of a leader is to define reality. And that's what I'm trying to do as we talk together. The last duty is to say thank you. And I won't wait till the last. I hope I say that often enough, because I am certainly thankful for all that you do for this congregation. And in the middle, the leader is to be a servant. You know, I don't know everybody here, and yet, together, we do need to have a direction. We do need to know, what is God's country? What is the promised land in this wilderness? How will we get there? As a community, together. Well, as you might guess, I don't come without any conceptions. My first thing will be to talk with many of you, and I've already done some of that. What is it that you hope for this community? Where is your promised land for this community? Or would you rather just go back to Egypt than be enslaved by the ways of today? But beyond asking and learning, I also have some conception as to what ought to be done. First and foremost, it's to build community. Now, a lot of that already is here. I get it. I mean, I think I've said it before. I've never been to a church that has a better fellowship time. The eats are really good, but people hang around. I shouldn't say I've never been. I've been to one other church that I was not the pastor. I was just a participant there when I worked at the Board of Higher Ed in Nashville. And that church was Edge Hill United Methodist. And I remember one of the people joining saying, we drove by and church was getting out. A half an hour later, we drove by and people were still talking. That's the kind of congregation I want to be a part of. Not that we're all alike, but that we all respect one another and seek to help one another in our growth. So it is about community. Each day, each week, each month, God is calling us to the promised land. We're in the wilderness. And you need to ask some questions. Where's Pharaoh's army? Where are those things that really make you fearful? How can they be less fearful in your life? We're in the desert. What do you thirst for? What is it that really makes you want to move forward? You know, what are our habits of prayer and service? For they will be our keel and rudder, our faith and our direction. As a community, will we successfully traverse from the wilderness to the promised land? Now, I want to say right here that even when Israel got to the promised land, they still didn't remain faithful all the time, did they? Israel and Judea had its ups and its downs. So even geographically, if you make it to the promised land, you still got work to do. But the work is depending upon God and the Christian community that you're in. It would be my hope that a year from now, none of you will be the same. That in our searching, we will grow. Now that's not easy. Because friends know you as you are. Now if they're really friends and they respect you, as you change, they'll adapt. But you need to know that the relationship will have to change too. But it's worth it to live in God's country. As individuals, it's always more comfortable to sit in Egypt. As a community, it's always more comfortable to say, oh, if it could only be 1970 again. But it isn't. In the wilderness, the question is, do we go back and enslave ourselves to Pharaoh again? Or do we go forward in the hope of a new land, of a new community, a community that clearly loves one another and loves God? Hopefully, we won't sit. We'll grow in our knowledge. We'll grow in our faith. We'll grow in our prayer life. Indeed, we will still, in some ways, be in the three countries: Egypt, the wilderness, and the promised land. The question is, as we live, will we be citizens of God's country? Because such citizenship is what brings us abundant